Our next topic, which is titled The Law and Asian American Exclusion, will combine some conceptual material with some historical discussion to reveal how the law socially constructs race. And in this case, it will lead to the exclusion of Asians from national belonging. Now, by this time in the course, this reality of exclusion through the law should be readily apparent to you as a recurrent theme. We discussed, for example, anti-Chinese legislation that culminated with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Let's not forget aliens ineligible for citizenship. In the case of the Japanese, we talked about the Gentleman's Agreement and a couple of alien land acts. With Filipinos coming over to the West Coast, we talked about anti-miscegenation laws and the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which all but ended the immigration of Filipino labor. So the law as an exclusionary mechanism is central to Asian American history. In fact, let's recall a helpful academic term here, and that term is differential inclusion. Hopefully you recall what that refers to. It kind of shows how persons are simultaneously included, and in this case, they're included in terms of their necessity as a cheap labor force, yet also they're excluded at the same time, right? And they're excluded from, again, national belonging. So the law is an effective instrument here that makes differential inclusion possible. And by the way, look at this slide here. I think it's a good quote because it highlights a couple of themes that we've been focusing on so far in this course. And this quote, which is regarding Asian immigration to the United States, was actually found in a personal letter that he wrote to someone. So here's what he writes, quote, "In the matter of Chinese and Japanese coolie immigration, I stand for the national policy of exclusion or restricted immigration. We cannot make a homogeneous population out of people who do not blend with the Caucasian race. Oriental coolieism will give us another race problem to solve, and surely we have had our lesson." So here is the President Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, is a very intelligent person. He was an academic professor at Princeton before he was president, wrote some very influential books in political science. And here he is making some mistakes here, which shouldn't surprise us because most Americans basically conceived of Asians in a similar way. First of all, what should have struck out to you right away was his use of the word coolie, which, as refers to indentured labor. But we also know this: the Chinese and the Japanese were not coolies. They were indeed contract laborers. They were voluntary or a voluntary labor force. They were sojourners, right? At least the Chinese and the earliest Japanese. And the second thing that he assumes here is an Orientalist belief. If you recall, one central tenet in Orientalism is that Orientals cannot assimilate to Western culture or Occidental culture. So notice he states here, we cannot make a homogeneous people or population out of people who do not blend with the Caucasian race. Okay, so he feels that Orientals cannot blend, cannot assimilate with the Caucasian race or Occidental race. So there we go. You see Wilson making two mistakes here in the way he's thinking about Asians back then. Now, I have to say there's very few Asians. We've been discussing Asian American history. You can't assume that the population of Asians were similar to that of, let's say, African Americans. Actually, very small number of Asians were found. And let's remember, the vast majority are found on the West Coast. Now, earlier I just mentioned that the law is going to function as an exclusionary mechanism to prevent Asians from national belonging. And it's also going to serve a function in defining Asian Americans, as well as other races in the United States. As we now know, race is a social construction. So here we have to revisit the notion of race as a social construction, since what will be revealed here is the role and the function of law in socially constructing race, which we've discussed. By the way, let's remember an early example, the one-drop rule, right? The law of hypodescent, whereby a person assumes the legal identity of the quote-unquote lesser race, hence the term hypo rather than hyper. So that's the law of hypodescent. So the central concept here with social construction in general, not just of race, but a lot of our reality as socially constructed, right? The argument is that, the argument from social scientists and historians and philosophers, they argue that much that we take for granted as objectively real is actually created by us. It is not objectively real, as if it exists in nature. No, it is actually socially constructed. That is to say, it's invented by us humans in social interactions, rather than existing independent of our own existence. So, and eventually what happens is that people accept these socially constructed entities as real. Now, we've been focusing on race, but also other concepts can be thought of as socially constructed, or should be thought of as socially constructed, such as, let's say, gender. Things you take for granted as natural gender norms or gender roles. You'll be surprised the degree to which these vary across history and vary across culture. And another entity we may take for granted as being real is something like money. But in fact, people assign value to money on this, colored paper. People agree that, okay, this currency that we call money actually has value when in fact someone made it up, right? Or a group of people made it up. Another socially constructed entity is the nation in modern history. People create nations. If you think about a lot of nations that were created by Western empires during colonialism, like Iraq, for example. If you look at Iraq, straight lines, right, defining it. Someone just said, hey, let's create this nation called Iraq. Here's the straight lines, north, south, east, and west. And from now on, you people within this area, you're now Iraqis. Well, before that period that England and others invaded Iraq, it didn't exist, right? Or our country did not exist before July 4th, 1776. Never get the idea that planet Earth carves out natural boundaries for nations, right? People do. Another thing, is property ownership, right? Land ownership. This is a relatively new and modern idea in human history that arose with capitalism. Before that, there was no conception as we think of it today. And indeed, many societies outside of Europe, like Native Americans, for example, they didn't believe in private property. How could you own land? That's like saying you own the air that we breathe, right? So these are all examples of things we take for granted as being natural, but in fact, someone created or people created it. Now, if you recall, in an earlier lecture, we discussed how race stems from this project of classification. That is, humans classify, that's often based on what is seen as natural, as if they exist naturally in nature. Not unlike other classifications, let's say, used in science. For example, biology and its various classifications and taxonomies and what have you. Well, the same thing was applied to different skin color with the quote-unquote human race. Yet such racial classifications, that is to say skin color and, non-physical features that became attached to it, which we discussed. Again, these are created by people, not nature, but eventually they become normalized. It was human decisions that created them and have assigned them primacy and priority as a way to differentiate different types of people. So let's think about this further. Now look at this diagram before you, and it's going to illustrate the problem of classification. You see these objects or entities, and there's 6 of them, and the question is, how can you categorize? How can you create different categories and classifications for these 6 entities before you? Well, right off the bat, let me check it out. I could put this, number 1, number 3, and number 6 together. Why? Because they're divided in half, right down the middle, right? So there's 1, 3, and 6, and everything else. So there's 2 categories. There are 2 classifications. Still another way, I could say, hey, number 2 and number 4 are quartered, and the rest are not quartered. So 2 and 4 belong in one category. 1, 3, 5, and 6 belong to the other category. Still another way, I could say, hey, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 belong to the same category. Why? Because they have these lines running through it, right? These smaller lines. So number 1 stands on its own. Still another way, I could say number 1, number 2, and number 6 belong all together. Why? Because they have this white area, okay? The other areas don't have this white areas, like 1, 2, and 6, and so on. You could probably go further with this. I'm sure you can. In fact, we've just been separating according to 2 categories. You could still separate according to 3 categories. You could say, for example, that, there's one category with 2 and 4 included because they're quartered, and then the second category would be 1, 3, and 6 because they're halved. And then the third category would be number 5 on its own. Okay. In fact, you could come up with 6 separate categories. Oh, they're all different. So why should you place them in the same category? So hopefully it's clear to you how, this is somewhat of a problem, because the question is, which category should you prioritize? Now, in a similar way, you could even ask the question, why emphasize and prioritize skin color over the numerous ways to differentiate between people? For example, you could place emphasis on language, or perhaps culture, or even subculture like religion, which is the way they did it before the modern era, as we discussed earlier. Why not prioritize social class over race, or perhaps level of education? In fact, why not base it on other physical traits that don't relate to skin color, like height or weight or eye color for that matter? So you could see why this notion that people have emphasized skin color, especially during the modern era, is completely arbitrary. When you think about the numerous possibilities that exist to classify and to differentiate. Now, before we dismiss this as just a benign exercise, here's what we have to remember historically, that sure, it's an arbitrary decision to foreground and to prioritize race, but look what that has led to. The most egregious and deplorable acts that have been committed within the human species have been based on race, okay, in the modern era. 6 million Jews killed, exterminated, acts of genocide by one race over the other, the Aryan race trying to eradicate the Jewish race. Think about racialized slavery in our country, where one race was attached to slavery, and so on. You could come up with numerous examples of this.